And to finish this discussion today, I would like to introduce to you one other very interesting research approach that is called person-oriented approach. Why is it so interesting? Because essentially it is an approach that uses quantitative methodology with qualitative ideology. Why? Because essentially it's a holistic approach to understanding personality. Instead of focusing on individual personality characteristics, we focus on integral personality profiles or personality types. We are trying to understand what kind of person this is, a person with such a combination of scores. How does she or he live? Why does she or he act in a certain way? So essentially we are trying to develop a kind of psychological portrait, even though it's not an individual portrait, it's a portrait of a group. When and why is this methodology useful? Of course, if you just have a couple of traits like extroversion and neuroticism, you have no problem. You just have basically a two-dimensional space, and each person is a point in this space, and it's very easy to summarize this information and to understand it. However, when the number of variables in your study becomes large, it becomes increasingly difficult to understand how they interact and to make some predictions. For example, if you do some kind of a regression analysis, already just with 5 personality traits that form the Big Five model, already there might be very many interactions between those traits. For example, extroversion might have slightly different effects if a person has a high neuroticism or low neuroticism. So essentially it's a hypothesis about interaction of two variables. But if you want to model this interaction, you need to include it in your regression analysis, and this increases your number of variables. So for example, if you just have only 5 personality traits, the number of interactions that are possible are already 26. And if you have a regression with 26 plus 5 with 31 variables, this is just too much for any feasible sample. And so if you focus on variables, with a large number of variables, this becomes extremely heavy. And another problem is if in your sample there are individuals with different psychological processes, with different patterns of psychological processes, any effects that you get at the level of variables, they only reflect some kind of average picture. Imagine that you have in your organization some people doing a job where extroversion is good for success, and another bunch of employees who are working in a job where actually it's introverts who are more successful. Let's think maybe some kind of managers and maybe programmers. So if you combine them all in a single sample and you calculate a correlation of extroversion with job performance, this correlation might be actually extremely weak. But it's not because it's absent. It's because there are different individuals for whom this correlation has different signs. And if you combine them all in one sample, you get a kind of an average temperature in the hospital, an average effect. And of course, if you just have one variable predictor like extroversion, it's no problem to maybe try and separate those groups. But if you have many such variables, and if you don't know what kind of characteristics can be used to separate those groups, then you have a huge problem. Because using variable-based approach, it's not often easy to understand what's going on. So this person-oriented approach was proposed by a Swedish researcher, David Magnusson, in the 1980s. It was proposed mainly within the context of developmental psychology to understand different patterns of personality development, different pathways of development that lead people to different outcomes. And the difference between the traditional approach and the person approach is illustrated by this diagram. So in the traditional approach, we focus only on variables. Every person has a score on each variable. And we often look at those variables in isolation, or we combine them all together in some kind of a statistical model, but we are not typically trying to combine those scores. Actually, we don't care about individual scores at all. We just forget about them as soon as we have cleaned our data. In case of the person approach or person-oriented approach, what we aim to do is actually to find out and identify groups of individuals with similar score profiles. We might call them types, but when you say type, actually you need some kind of a theoretical basis. So maybe it's better to call them not types, but some kind of empirical profiles or patterns of personality functioning. And for each person, we get a certain combination of scores, and this combination of scores, it's like a psychological profile of a single person. And we use our qualitative skills to interpret this profile and to understand how it works. So essentially, when you have many variables and you have a hard time summarizing those variables or identifying which of them are important, you might instead try to identify individual patterns, typical combinations of traits, and you can use some kind of cluster analysis or latent profile analysis, which is a more contemporary, more modern, and more robust version of cluster analysis to identify those groups of individuals with specific score profiles that are qualitatively distinct, that develop based on different principles. And this can also be applied to longitudinal data. You can identify individuals with different patterns of change. For example, people whose well-being improves and people whose well-being deteriorates during several years based on repeated measurements. And in order to do this, you can also apply classical cluster analysis or latent transition analysis, which is again a more contemporary methodology. And essentially, in this case, you combine nomothetic approach with qualitative interpretation. You might, for example, identify those profiles and then identify individual cases and use them, the typical individual cases, you can use them to illustrate those profiles. So essentially, this approach attempts to complement the quantitative nomothetic perspective with a bit of qualitative touch to obtain some richer information. And this approach has become fairly popular in contemporary psychological science, just because many researchers have realized that variable-based approach does not allow us to capture the diversity of individual patterns of functioning. And if individuals have different patterns of functioning, then we need somehow to identify them to separate this diversity into groups. And we did also use this research in our studies with colleagues. One paper with Helena Kalitievskaya, where we identified different patterns of development of autonomy in teenagers, or another paper with Ilona Bonivel, where we tried to identify different profiles of time perspective, and we managed to identify a profile of balanced time perspective, which theoretically was supposed to be the best in terms of well-being, and this was indeed the case. And in doing this person-oriented analysis, you can go in two directions. Either you might have some kind of theoretical expectation about the profiles that are supposed to emerge, and you might try to look for them specifically, or you might just investigate those empirical profiles and then use them to derive some kind of theory. So both of these strategies are quite possible. So if you encounter this notion of person-oriented approach, don't be scared. Essentially, it's good old quantitative methodology, but a little bit more advanced, applied to understand and classify individual patterns. In our materials, you can find a couple of chapters discussing mixed method studies. Well, basically, if you want to go mixed methods, just look up those chapters to find out a good label for your research design. And then if you say just, oh, we did some questionnaires and we collected some open-ended answers, it's not so persuasive. But if you say, oh, we used a mixed method study with an embedded design with a dominant quantitative paradigm, this produces quite a different impression on the reviewers and on your master's thesis committee. So this is probably the end of our course for now. We have explored different aspects of psychological research, different methodologies, and of course this course is very heavily laden with a lot of information, so don't be scared if maybe not all of it is seems useful for you right now, but at least our goal is not to hold everything in our head, right? If we are professional researchers, actually we know what is out there in psychological methodology, and we know in which book to look up for a procedure or an approach that we might need. So I hope that this excursion into the field of research methods has given you a perspective on psychology as a field and on the research procedures that we can use in order to obtain some valid and reliable findings and the methodologies that we can use in order to be rigorous rather than lousy in our conclusions, because we want to conduct interesting studies, but also studies that are replicable, studies that contribute to the advancement of human knowledge, because this is our goal as scientists. And I hope that this course has given you a little bit more of ground to stand on when you will be trying to reach this goal in your master's thesis or in your future PhD dissertations if you decide to pursue a research career. And I definitely wish you success in those pursuits, and I hope we'll see each other later on. Good luck, and thank you for taking this course.